Hi, I'm Phil Kaveny, your host for tonight, and we're doing another episode of our series, The Foundations of the Fantastic. And tonight I'm going to do a presentation on H.G. Wells, and as I tend to do things, I will move from the personal to the literary, to the historical, to the critical, or something like that. Well, this all starts in 1976. I was sort of had an interest in science fiction and fantasy from when I was a child. I enjoyed the films, and there was a used bookstore in Mattison called Abel's Books, located on Johnson Street in the 900 block. And that's where I found Experiment in Autobiography. And this is H.G. Wells' recollection of his life in 1930. H.G. Wells was born in 1866, and he died in 1946. It was fascinating because the theme of his biography was the recollection of an ordinary mind in extraordinary times. One of the quotes from the introduction is, "If there was ever a brain exhibition," and we were matching our brains, and of course Wells was a biologist and he was a student of Huxley. He said, "Mine would probably be third class okay, but I have had the privilege of living in these extraordinary times, and I've had a part of it, and I'm going to work my way back and I'm going to tell you about it." Well, Wells was very, very interesting. He was born in 1866. Britain, of course, was going through a transformation from early to late industrial revolution, going from kind of a canal-based economy to a railroad-based economy, from a sailing ship economy to a steamship economy, and was almost at her apogee, where she would stay for another almost 50 years, exactly 50 years, as a world power. This was a time when the sun did not set on the British Empire. H.G. Wells was born in Kent, in very ordinary, almost lower class circumstances. His mother was a serving lady, and his father was a kind of a professional cricket player, sporting goods shop owner, and Wells himself was a sickly child. His father left early, and his mother did what she could for him. But this was a time when public education was becoming part of the British life. It was a time when the British economy was expanding, and there was a need for a literate, educated working class. And that meant that Wells would at least get primary education. Now, something happened with him. It happens with a number of writers, and it turns out to be a boon, though at the time it appears to be a curse. He was a sickly child, and his family owned books. I think for some reason his grandmother had books. Books were being brought in at that time, views of the world, encyclopedias. There was a particular book which illustrated some 40-foot being and explained how that because of the square cube law, this could not be possible. This sort of took Wells's imagination. He would think about these things. And when it came time for him to do something, he was apprenticed as a draper, failed at that. He was apprenticed as a pharmacist. He failed at that. He worked in a department store. He failed at that. And thinking of nothing else that they could do with him, they continued to educate him. And he attended university in London, where he worked briefly with Huxley again. And he was fascinated by what interested him, but what didn't interest him, he cared little about. And in a sense, I know this type. I was this type when I was 21. You're sort of drifting. You're sort of desperate. He was grading papers. At that time, again, the historical starts to move in, and there was an external degree program which he taught for. He married his cousin. It was a very sad marriage, or loveless marriage, named Veronica in 1890. And a couple years later, he threw it in, and he was an essayist and a professional writer. And he also ran into a woman named Amy Catherine. Okay, there's a wonderful section in the experiment and autobiography in which he has divorced Veronica. He is wooing Amy Catherine. They're living in sin, which is something amazing in late Victorian England, and he's writing the time machine. The time machine is being serialized. I think it was a Strand magazine. That doesn't matter so much. But this was a time in Victorian England where the wheels of change are moving more. There's an acceleration. There's a transformation. We're moving from an early industrial economy almost to a modern economy. The telephone is in place. Of course, the telegraph, electric lighting. People are reading more. And there's a bourgeoisie working class who no longer can read the three-decker Victorian novel. A man named Brian Stableford and the Victorian romance, scientific romance, I believe 1890 to 1914, does a wonderful analysis of this particular phenomenon. But what this meant is that because Wells had a scientific education and a visionary mind, there was an infrastructure there which could accept his product. It would almost be the equivalent of 100 years later, at the outset of the internet, you having web skills. And suddenly he is in a position where if his first story is successful, these slick magazines can pay him more for one story than he could make in a year teaching. And he's sitting there in the room, knowing he has to come to the end of the story. Amy Catherine is sleeping. A woman like him, like her, by the way, is portrayed in the 1977 film Time After Time, which maybe you remember. It creates a historical Wells who's cast into the future with a real time machine. Well, there really wasn't Amy Catherine. And in any case, all depends on how the story ends. He sees a giant moth out the window, and he realizes that somehow if he can include a strange thing from the future and he brings it back, this will be proof that he has been to this other place. Now we move ahead a little bit in Wells's career. I have to look at some notes here. There are wonderful resources out there for those of you that have access to a public library or a university library, and yet they're good to a point, but they're not definitive. He now becomes a hot thing. There's a demand for his work. He writes next, The Island of Dr. Moreau, originally published in 1896. And this is appeared in many cinematic versions. And the idea of it is that by surgical mutilation, transformation, doing with a scalpel, which we would do genetically now, there can be a transformation that will take place in which animals can assume a kind of human form. And again, I have to talk about the print universe at that time. 1896 is before radio. It's certainly before television. Edison is doing his little film studio there in 1896. But at that time, print media is exceedingly important. There's an infrastructure to distribute these magazines. Copy can be transmitted transatlantically, and the likes of Oscar Wilde is outraged by the premise of Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau. I don't intend to have this be a bibliographical essay, but now, as you remember earlier, I had mentioned that this was a time, he's now approaching 31 years old of age. Britannia rules the waves. The British fleet by itself is twice as large as any other fleet in the world, and I believe the equal of the combined fleets of the major power. Britain is at the peak of their civilization. This is the imperialistic, missionary, positivistic cultural expansion. And this is the time in which he writes War of the Worlds. Picture, if you will, an alien intelligence looking down upon us with a careful, calculating eye, much like we would look into a microscope at an amoeba or protozoa, envying us for what we have, carefully calculating and planning. And then the Martian invasion takes place. And Britannia is nothing against their weapons. There's a chapter on the destruction of the British Navy, the tripod-like machines manned by these particular creatures pretty much has their way with Great Britain. And in the end, the British Empire is brought to its knees, brought to panic and barbarism, and yet the only thing that saves them is what in the film version, the George Pal version of the film, they transform into God's smallest creatures, and the Martians cannot survive in the toxicity of the Earth's atmosphere. Well, okay. So War of the Worlds puts him into the front. He's into the limelight. There's a chapter in this book called Fairly Started at Last. And this is a guy, in 1899, he's getting big money. He's getting maybe, for some of his stuff, he got £1 a word. And at that time, a pound, it's hard to say, but a pound was worth $5 American. And an American laborer was lucky if he made $2 a day. And sometimes Wells would get this for a word. And so here you have a man who 5 years before is being done by his landlady, and now he's assuming kind of a cultural importance. Another thing about Wells is he believed in education. He believed at one of his points, trained by Huxley, believing in evolution, he once said the future would be a race between education and catastrophe. Well, with that in mind, he wrote in 1898, When the Sleeper Wakes. And this is, in some ways, the penultimate Victorian romance. A man sleeps for 100 years and wakes up into a corporate world which he owns because his principle has increased, and evil forces have taken over. And it envisioned a world which had split between the haves and the have-nots, and some sort of egalitarian Fabian socialism is his creed, his belief. He's not a Marxist, he's not a revolutionary socialist, but he's of the belief that with man's humanity's capability for reason, that socialism would be viewed as the best and the necessary system. Now, it's funny that I would use the phrase man's belief, because Wells, among everything else, was a feminist. He believed in the liberation of women. It was to get into him a lot of trouble because he believed in sexual liberation also. And the earlier, his Amy Catherine was replaced by a number of lovers, among them, as a matter of fact, the British novelist Rebecca West, whose son wrote this biography of H.G. Wells, who was his illegitimate father. Well, okay. The first man on the moon predicts sort of space travel through an anti-gravity device, and in a sense does kind of a social criticism of what can happen with an urban industrial specialized uneducated proletariat. Now I have to move back a little bit when I talk about Wells' origins of his socialism, because I mentioned the time machine before, but I didn't talk enough about its content. And one of its subtexts was to extrapolate kind of a two-class situation in which you have the Morlocks, your formal industrial proletariat, and the Eli. And the Morlocks have been driven under the surface of the earth by some catastrophe, and the Eli live on the surface, kind of like feed cattle for them. Again, George Pal did a very nice edition of The Time Machine. It's a little bit different from the book, but it's amazing with Wells' stuff how much it sort of transforms. In this way, it has a certain, I was thinking about this, a mythic property to it. Now again, War of the Worlds, it's important to realize that we do not win because we're heroic. We win because the earth is an inhospitable place for the adversary. And this, to me, makes it a much superior film than perhaps Independence Day. Okay, well, what I'm doing now is I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit more. Wells, sadly, treated his visionary works as if they were juvenilia, and sort of expected that he would be remembered for his literary works. Actually, it's sort of funny to look at him, because you see this almost shark-faced young man, and then you see a round-faced man in middle age with a bowler hat, becoming quite properly British and quite properly pompous. Well, The Days of the Comet is one of his other visionary works, which postulates a world in which a partially fatal comet passes through the Earth's atmosphere, and those that awake from the gaseous invasion experience kind of a peace that passeth all understanding, in which war disappears, and brother loves brother in almost a biblical Christian kind of love, which is sort of interesting, because of course Wells himself would have considered religion to be superstitious, perhaps at best, and at worst a misdirection. Well, I have to go a little further. I want to talk about The War in the Air and The World Set Free. The War in the Air is one of his last science fiction novels. I'm looking at my bibliography, and 1908, and it predicts what effect the emerging air power will have on the face of warfare, the economy of production of airplanes, and I believe an air war takes place in which Japan wins, and again, civilization is reduced. Okay, I'm going to move ahead a little bit more. I'm hoping that I'm getting the content of this right, but The World Set Free postulates something like an atomic bomb. A world after an atomic bomb in which basically you have to start over. His vision is starting to change now from utopian to apocalyptic. Now, as this is happening, World War I is on the horizon. And we find that Wells is now moved from the stage of an observer to the stage of a chronicler to the stage of a policymaker, an advisor. He's an advocate for the League of Nations. He's on committees to decide what the shape of the post-World War will be. He's a visionary. He's in the Council of Powers. This guy that 25 years ago could not pay his rent has what we would refer to as the fields of power. Now I'm going to kind of escalate. I have one more thing to talk about in terms of his sort of literary output he produces until 1946. and he writes articles. He wrote The Outline of History in 1922. The function of The Outline of History was to explain the catastrophe of history to humanity, so we did not repeat the failures of the First World War. By now he's getting darker, he's sensing the inevitability of folly, he's losing some of his confidence in human reason, and yet in this he makes a film called Things to Come, based on his novel Things to Come. And Things to Come anticipates the Second World War, extends it 30 more years. It's fought, quite interestingly enough, over oil, as our wars are being fought now. And he pictures a world, again, reduced to barbarism, saved essentially by a technocratic elite who come in from the air. Raymond Massey is one of them, and do whatever is necessary to reestablish order. I've mentioned the film versions before, so I don't have to do too much more with that. Wells, during the Second World War, has kind of an advisory stance to the British government, actually has some observations on sonar and anti-submarine warfare, and he's sort of venerentially treated. It's sort of interesting to see this. I didn't talk too much about Wells within the theater of literary politics. I must mention that he was offered a seat on the British Academy. This is a very big deal, and he refused it. He and Henry James entered into a discourse about the function of literature. James was of the opinion that it had an artistic function and served no master, but to Wells, literature served a didactic educational function in which you would sort of encompass a problem in a way that the man in the street would be able to think about it, think about a solution, and work out your cultural problems in a way that an educated population could then do something. Well, Wells certainly won in terms of book sales, but I have to say, sadly, James won in the classroom. And anyone who has studied English now, literature now, will have to get a prelim question that focuses around the evolution of the Jamesian aesthetic, which developed out of the correspondence between James and Wells. Okay, I'm going to move to 1946. In an American science fiction magazine, there's a little note. British science fiction writer H.G. Wells dies. He's 80 years old. He's been writing for 50 years. He has almost 100 works. Numerous cinematic adaptations of his works are available. As I said, Spielberg will be doing another one in 2004. This leads me to think that there's a sort of mythic, morphological aspect of his work, which allows each age to choose the proper format to present the ideas. And he would have no problem with the big ideas of his work. It would not be too disappointed if people suggested that the literary content was a bit archaic, although some still now even find him quite readable, as I do. Well, we're getting to the end of this production, and I've considered it a privilege to be a part of this series, The Foundation of the Fantastic. I look forward to doing other episodes of it. Again, Wells is relevant even today. The idea of the race between the fantastic, I should say the catastrophe in education. A catastrophe in education is a good thought in a time when we're cutting back on education and we're cutting back on literature. And there's a rationality which seems always at the edge of the world, always ready to step in, always willing to, if you will, sectarianize us into smaller and smaller groups so we don't see the world vision, so we don't think of a League of Nations or a UN. And it's interesting to note that had we brought in the Wells's vision of the United Nations, it's possible, in fact, that there might not have been a Second World War. We're getting towards the end. I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and I'm happy to have been your host. Good night and good reading.